71-year-old Thomas Rendell appeared to have lived a typical life. He had been married to his wife for 40 years and resided in Lynnfield, Massachusetts. Employed as a golf pro at a country club, he had a daughter who had grown up and started her own family. However, Thomas was concealing a secret, one he disclosed only in his final days. Diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, he shocked his family with a revelation they could never have imagined before his passing on May 18, 2021. His real name was not Thomas, their last name was not Rendell, and he had been a wanted fugitive evading the FBI since 1969. On July 14, 1969, the Society National Bank in Cleveland, Ohio, opened its doors to discover $215,000 missing from the vault. An investigation into the theft began, focusing on the last person to close the vault the previous Friday, 20-year-old teller Theodore John Conrad, who also was absent from the bank that morning. The inquiry found that he had walked out of the bank after closing, carrying a brown paper bag filled with cash, and had simply vanished from his life. A warrant for his arrest went out, but with a 2-day head start it left law enforcement at a disadvantage. Conrad is reported to have never contacted his family in Ohio ever again, leaving behind his parents and 3 siblings, but he wrote letters to a girlfriend confirming he stayed in the U.S. with letters coming from Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Hawaii. In one of the letters, he revealed he had intentions to return home in 7 years once the statute of limitations ran out on the theft, but he then discovered that wasn't going to happen on the federal charges of embezzlement. Conrad's crime didn't make much of a splash in the news. A week after the theft was Apollo 11's historic flight to the moon, which dominated the attention of all of the news outlets, giving Conrad even more time to escape and settle in somewhere with next to no one watching him. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Okay, let's continue. However, one U.S. Marshal made it his mission to find Conrad. John Elliott devoted his entire career to searching, eventually retiring in 1990. He passed on the investigation to his son, Peter Elliott, who was also a U.S. Marshal. Through the investigation and interviewing those who'd been close to Conrad, no one really believed he'd stolen the money in some sort of grand heist. He just wanted to do it to see if he could get away with it. The early belief that he could just return home after 7 years had been an indication that he hadn't really thought through his punishment for the crimes, and he hadn't really put much thought into leaving his whole life forever. Conrad was reported to have been obsessed with the movie The Thomas Crown Affair that had come out in 1968 and had been filmed in Boston. It followed a bank robber played by Steve McQueen, who was a bank executive who walked out of a bank with $2,600,000. The film featured a character with expensive taste in luxury cars and high-end liquor, and Conrad wanted to emulate the character Thomas. $215,000, while at the time was a lot of money, it was equivalent to about $1,500,000 in today's dollars. It was enough to live off for the rest of his life, and at only 20, it certainly wasn't enough to retire off of. But after 5 decades, it was starting to look like a case that was never going to be solved until Peter Elliott saw an obituary that caught his attention. Thomas Randall's obituary revealed details that closely matched Conrad's and made Elliott take a closer look into who this Rendell person was. Rendell started appearing in Massachusetts in 1970. There had been no record of him before that. From records, it appeared that Conrad walked into a Boston Social Security office with a new identity and got a Social Security card with a new forged identity. From there, he was able to live his life very normally, opening a bank account, working, paying taxes. No concern had ever been raised about Thomas Rendell. Rendell certainly hadn't lived an extravagant life. He spent several decades working as a car salesman. He and his wife had declared bankruptcy in 2014. And when he died, he didn't leave a substantial sum of money for his children to inherit. Once Elliott had enough evidence to connect Rendell to Conrad, he interviewed his family, who admitted that on his deathbed, Rendell revealed that he was Theodore Conrad, a wanted fugitive for a bank robbery. His wife, Kathy, made the decision not to go to law enforcement with the deathbed confession. She stated that she was still grieving the loss of her husband, and she said he was a great man. Many of his friends had similar sentiments. He was known as a nice, caring man who loved golf and cars. He was never known to badmouth anyone, raise his temper or voice, wasn't a drinker, and didn't gamble. But after it was revealed, little things started to make sense. Randall always wore a beard. It was a running joke that, in group photos, he would always put on sunglasses. He never talked about his family or where he grew up, but people just chalked it up to a bad childhood. A close family friend told the media, quote, "The man I knew didn't change all of a sudden because of something he did a lifetime ago. He was a good man, he was a good friend, and I think no less of him today than I did when all this came out, and I'd love to go play another round of golf with him." Conrad has surviving siblings who are believed to know he lived a happy life. Theodore's parents had passed never knowing what happened to their son, and much of their family had believed he had died after he disappeared for decades. After 52 years, the mystery of what happened to Theodore Conrad and the bank heist he committed has been closed. His family is not being looked at further. The money is believed to have been spent on bad investments before Conrad was married, and there won't be any criminal charges made for his family for not immediately going to law enforcement with the deathbed confession. On March 10, 2019, Roger Lloyd Taylor disappeared. After an argument with his wife, the 48-year-old got into his car to pick her up from their daughter's house in Monroe County, Alabama. En route, he texted his daughter that he was lost, and that was the last anyone heard from him. Days later, his abandoned car was discovered on the side of the road. For weeks, law enforcement and local search parties combed the area where his vehicle was located, but there was no trace of Roger. His family revealed that they feared he'd had a medical emergency as he only recently recovered from a heart attack and a stroke, which had left him with permanent physical mobility issues and memory lapses. His vehicle didn't show any signs of mechanical issues, and it's unclear what had happened to him. Weeks turned into months and then years. Without any new evidence, Roger's disappearance turned into a cold case, leaving his family with so many questions. A cold case that may have never been solved. However, in September 2022, a shocking revelation in the case came from a pastor who walked into the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and confessed to killing Roger Taylor. 37-year-old James Eric Crisp claimed that since the murder, he'd gone on to become pastor and found God and needed to confess in order to go forward with his life. Crisp stated that in 2019, he'd gotten into a physical altercation with Roger and had killed him, then disposed of his body 10 miles from where his vehicle had been left. He didn't reveal why or how he'd gotten into an altercation with Roger's, but Roger's daughter doesn't believe that the two knew each other. She did reveal that she knew Crisp and went on to say that Crisp had been involved in multiple search parties that had gone out to look for Roger in 2019. Crisp had a lengthy criminal history, and in 2019, he faced a 30-year prison sentence for various drug crimes, but entered God's House of Hope, a Christian rehab center, as part of his bail condition, got sober, and went on to become a pastor and counselor. After Crisp's confession, he was charged with manslaughter. Roger's children attended the bond hearing. Roger's daughter said that in a statement to the media, quote, "He looked me in the eye and told me he killed my dad. He didn't say he was sorry. He just said that he hoped one day I could find it in his heart to forgive him, but never even said he was sorry. He didn't have any emotions. When he was outside of the room, he was laughing with the jailer and walked in and acted all stone cold with me." She doesn't believe Crisp's confession is motivated by his newfound faith, but rather she believes that someone close to Crisp knew about the murder and was going to come forward to law enforcement. Crisp is said to be helping to locate Roger's body. However, the area in question had recently been subject to flooding and is said to have shifted the landscape and has made finding his body more difficult. At this time, Roger Taylor's body has yet to be found. Crisp has asked for the Taylor family's forgiveness. However, they said in a response, if we can't have his body back, we won't have closure. It was October 12, 1991, when 43-year-old Linda Lois Little missed her shift at the Chart House restaurant in Daytona Beach, Florida. It was very unusual for Linda to miss work, and it was her co-worker and friend who reported her missing. She was last seen at Maidie's Brig with a group of friends. At the bar, she told her friends that her boyfriend was coming to see her on the weekend, and they went through all the must-see spots in Daytona she had to take him to. That was also why it was so strange that Linda had disappeared, as it was clear to her friends that she had no plans to leave the area. Law enforcement canvassed the area and found a last sighting of the missing woman. Around 2 a.m., she was spotted riding her bike home and stopping at 711 There, she purchased a donut and chocolate milk before heading in the direction of her apartment. Her apartment was found undisturbed, which led investigators to believe she'd been abducted shortly after leaving the 711. Her body nor her bike were ever found. Her missing persons case eventually went cold once all leads were exhausted, and her family had always prayed for answers. But without a body, there was little hope of ever knowing what happened to Linda Little. For 3 decades, the case remained cold until Daytona Beach Police Department received a call from an incarcerated inmate recently transferred to the Tomoka Correctional Facility in Volusia County. 53-year-old Michael Townsend was serving a life sentence for the brutal 2007 murder of Sherry Carmato, and while serving his sentence, he found God and the Lord placed it in his heart to confess, and also revealed being close to the area. He had committed another crime had weighed heavy on his heart, and he wanted to confess to a crime he committed in 1991. He alleged that he'd gone to Daytona Beach for his birthday and met a woman at a bar. He said that the two had a couple of drinks, but she had said something that made him snap, and he confessed to abducting, strangling, and burying the body of Linda Little. In addition to confessing to Linda's murder, he confessed to murdering 2 other women in Florida. At this time, investigations are still ongoing to corroborate these confessions. However, Daytona Beach had enough information to determine whether this confession was credible for Linda Little's murder. When asked why he killed the 4 women he confessed to murdering, he stated that he'd been abused by his father and grandfather as a child and blamed his mother and the other women in his life growing up for not protecting him and grew to have a hatred towards women. 31 years after Linda's disappearance, her murderer was finally charged. Townsend was indicted by a grand jury on October 24, 2022 on the charge of first-degree murder. An ongoing investigation is still going to recover Linda's body in the area where Townsend admitted to burying her, as well as the other murders of the other women. If determined that all the killings he confessed to are credible, Townsend will be classified as a serial killer. Already serving a life sentence, he will remain in prison for the rest of his life or may face the death penalty if convicted. Linda's sister, Wanda Henson, thanked Townsend for coming forward and confessing. She said at the press conference announcing his arrest that she was grateful to have answers about her sister and went on to say that she forgives him. On April 20, 1998, a couple hiking at Maiden Water Spring discovered something on Highway 276 in Garfield County, Utah. They found a body, leading to the arrival of Park Services and the Garfield County Sheriff's Department. The authorities uncovered a woman wrapped in plastic bags, duct-taped, placed in a blue sleeping bag, and rolled in a carpet secured with rope. It was believed she had been deliberately positioned for discovery. An autopsy revealed that she was between 32 and 45 years old, with brown hair and brown eyes. She weighed approximately 110 pounds. She'd been shot in the back of the head execution style, and the killer had removed the tips of the fingers post-mortem. It was also noted that the body had frozen due to the below-freezing temperatures the day before the body had been found. Authorities had not been able to identify the victim. She would be called Maiden Water Victim Jane Doe, and the case would go cold. The case would eventually be handed to the Utah State Bureau of Investigation. Utah Bureau Agent Brian Davies did a press conference in 2018 trying to identify the Maiden Water Jane Doe. In October 2018, the Utah Department of Public Safety released a press conference asking for help identifying the victim. This press release also stated that they had considered serial killer Scott Kimball as a suspect and had yet to rule him out. This case had similarities to Kimball's other victims, but he denied involvement. Unknown to the Utah authorities, but around the same time as this press release, Ohio authorities were updating pictures of their missing persons database. A California true crime enthusiast saw the pictures of the missing person database and felt the connection to photos that had been released of the Maiden Water victim. He got in contact with Davies saying that he should look into this missing person case. They reviewed both cases, and both Davies and the Ohio authorities confirmed that they looked very similar and had a similar mole. They believed they might have found the victim's identity and had 2 family members come up and take DNA tests. In a November 28th press release, 20 years after the body was found, the Utah DPS confirmed the victim as missing 37-year-old Lena Reyes Jeeds. Lena had gone missing in 1998 when she left for a trip from her home with her husband, Edward Jeeds, to visit family in Mexico. She was supposed to travel through a Texas airport, but there was no record of her ever getting on any flights that day. She was reported missing 5 months later by her husband. Lena was a ballerina when she first met her husband in New Mexico, and they got married in '96 and moved to Youngstown, Ohio 6 months later. Now that they had identified Lena, they kept working on who her killer might be. Davis started looking back at the evidence, specifically at the rope she'd been tied in. With advances in DNA, they could use a technology that allowed them to extract DNA from a difficult surface like a rope. They did find 2 male samples of DNA. One was ruled out as the knot expert they had used previously to see if a special knot had been used. The other sample made them look back at Lena's husband, Edward. In 1998, Lena's husband had been the primary suspect during her disappearance because it had taken so long for her to be reported missing. He was brought in for questioning with law enforcement in October of '98, where he talked about a blue sleeping bag she was bringing as a gift. The last time he had seen her dropping her off at the airport, saying he didn't go in with her, and that she was planning on paying for the reserve ticket in cash. Unfortunately, Edward took his own life in 2001. Davies could not get a sample as he had been cremated after his death. Authorities then reached out to his living relatives asking for DNA samples. 2 came forward willingly, and 1 had to get a search warrant. The DNA came back as a familial match. In June of 2022, law enforcement announced that the case was closed and that they had discovered Lena's killer, her husband, Edward Jeeds. After 20 years, she got her name back, and after 24 years, her family got to know what happened and who killed her. In a January 2019 press release, Lena's sisters quoted saying, "I'm very grateful for all your work. I felt like for 20 years no one would listen to me, but now I know what happened. I'm here to bring her home, not like I expected, but I'm bringing her back home with me." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On July 17, 1985, at 3 a.m., a man called 911 from a trailer home on Travis Drive in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin, reporting that his neighbor had been stabbed. The victim was still alive but bleeding heavily. The dispatcher advised him to apply pressure to the wound, assuring him that help was on the way. During the call, the neighbor mentioned that the wife of the stabbed man had contacted him, urging him to come over quickly. He also revealed that he was holding a knife. The dispatcher instructed him to put it down. At that moment, a female voice could be heard saying, "One of my knives is missing," to which the man responded, "Hey, Yvonne, go back there and apply pressure." When the Wisconsin Rapids police arrived, they found Benny Scruggs, identified by his wife, lying on a water bed in the trailer home, covered in blood with a towel over his wound. When the ambulance arrived, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Benny Scruggs was 28 years old. He married Yvonne Koschau on May 15, 1982, and they had 1 son together named Matthew. He worked as a baker at the Foodland East. An autopsy was performed with the cause of death being a single stab wound to the chest on the upper left-hand side. The wound had gone through his rib into his lung and almost out the back. The medical examiner was quoted as saying, "One hell of a big knife like a butcher knife and another 3/4 of an inch and there would have been a hole in the waterbed." Police at the time interviewed surrounding neighbors, Yvonne and the Scruggs babysitter. The couple had been out the night before, and the babysitter had reported that they came home in better spirits than average around 1 a.m. On the other hand, during her 3 interviews that evening, Yvonne would give different versions of what had happened. During her first interview with detectives, Yvonne said that the babysitter had left. Then she and Benny went to bed, him falling asleep right away and her lying awake. Then their 2-year-old son was crying. She went to his room for about 10 minutes before feeling something was off. When she went back to bed, she noticed a shovel was up against the fridge and the trailer door was open. That was strange because she always had a habit of locking the door. She then went to look for Benny and found him covered in blood. She then called the neighbor for help. In a second interview, only a few hours after the first, she said that they both fell asleep after the babysitter left and that their 2-year-old came into their bedroom crying. She then took the toddler to his bedroom for about 10 minutes and then noticed the shovel and the open back door on the way back. I checked in on Benny and then called the neighbor for help. During the second interview, Yvonne had stepped away for a moment. A detective overheard her talking to her friend with her stating, "I was asleep next to him. He got stabbed. I don't know." During her final interview, she had said that they both fell asleep. She woke up to her 2-year-old crying and Benny throwing up. She took her son to his room and then went back to Benny. He was covered in blood, and she called the neighbor. Detectives at the time believed that she was being uncooperative with their investigation. Police decided to drain a nearby pond in hopes of finding the missing murder weapon, but they did not find it in the pond. The alleged knife that Yvonne claimed was missing from the home was never found. Over the next few weeks, the authorities would interview neighbors, including Donald Meyer, who lived in a trailer just down the way with a woman and her child. Meyer would tell authorities that he'd previously had a sexual relationship with Yvonne when they worked together 4 or 5 years earlier. He also told police that Yvonne had a temper and that she probably killed her husband. He would continue to tell the police that he had not seen Yvonne again till the February of 1985, and that was about a week before Benny was stabbed. Yvonne had invited him over, Benny was not home, and they had sexual intercourse in the living room, and it was then that Yvonne had told him that if he wanted her, he knew how to get rid of Benny. Yvonne, in an August 1985 police interview, would confirm the sexual relationship with Meyer, saying that she didn't tell the police because she didn't think it was important and that she was embarrassed to tell anyone. She did, however, deny saying anything about getting rid of Benny. After 1993, the case would go dormant until 2012. At that time, Donald Meyer would stack up a lengthy criminal history and Yvonne would go on to get remarried. Donald Meyer was on trial for 10 counts of stalking jurors who had convicted him in a 2006 trial for threatening a judge. Knowing this would mean adding time to his sentence, he reached out to the Wisconsin Police Department and asked to speak to someone about Benny Scruggs' murder. In this interview, Meyer would implicate Yvonne, saying that she was trying to set him up for Benny's murder. He would also go on to say that he'd been over multiple times, and that one time she took him into the bedroom so his fingerprints would be there. He also drew an intricate diagram of the trailer and new facts about it, like the bedroom door would open and the trailer's back door was screwed shut. After this interview, detectives would interview other people who were around at the time of the murder. Some will remember talking to Yvonne about the murder in the following weeks or years. One witness said Yvonne had told them that she knew who killed Benny, and another said Yvonne had asked if she thought she had killed him. The witness asking, "Well, did you?" and Yvonne never answered. Another witness came forward after seeing an article in a newspaper in 2013 about Benny Scruggs' murder, saying her son had dated Yvonne between 1989 and 1990 while she was married to her new husband, who is now deceased. The witness said Yvonne said she loved both men, with the witness saying something like, "You can't have it both ways." According to them, Yvonne's answer was, "I killed one husband, I can kill another." The son, who was also in this interview, said that he had asked where the father of her child was, her answer being, "He's not with us anymore." He asked what happened and she answered, "Well, I killed him." She also said that she was drunk that night and didn't remember much. In 2013, detectives interviewed some of Meyer's fellow inmates. Those inmates said that Meyer liked to talk about how he'd been in an ongoing relationship with Yvonne around the time of the murder, that Yvonne had instructed him to throw the murder weapon in the garbage so it will be picked up in the morning by trash collection. Yvonne died in 2015 of acute alcohol poisoning and was never formally accused or charged with murder. More years would pass before any further progress on Benny Scruggs' murder investigation. In 2017, an inmate would tell detectives that Meyer had told him he had committed the murder, that he had done it because Yvonne had refused to be with him till her husband was dead. The same inmate had overheard him talking to someone on the phone about the murder. Police obtained the recording of the phone call. In 2022, Donald Meyer, now 60 years old, was charged with the murder of Benny Scruggs. In September 2022, he refused to come out of his cell for his preliminary hearing and refused to work with his public defender. In December, Meyer's public defender tried to get him a new preliminary hearing, but the judge said that they would not reward bad behavior. Meyer was present for this hearing and pleaded not guilty. His trial is currently set up for a video conference in April 2023, as during this trial we will find out what evidence law enforcement has against Meyer. However, regardless of the circumstances, he either perpetrated the murder or helped Yvonne cover up a murder case for 4 decades. On March 24, 1998, in Marysville, Washington, a father returned home from vacation with his girlfriend to discover his 19-year-old daughter deceased in her bedroom. The girl, Jennifer Brinkman, was originally meant to join them on the trip, but had decided at the last minute to stay home. An autopsy later revealed that she had been struck in the neck with an axe. While news reports from 1998 stated that the murder weapon had not been found, more recent updates indicate that the axe was located at the crime scene. Authorities at the time also collected additional evidence and DNA samples. Jennifer was described as a social person known to walk around Marysville to strike up conversations with strangers. She often used telephone dating and chat lines, which were used frequently in the 90s, to chat and connect with strangers. She was also known to use library computers to access online chat rooms. The Marysville Police Department would send in the evidence to the crime lab, but they were unable to get any matches to anything, and DNA was not as advanced as it is today. Jennifer's case would eventually go cold, and the case would move from detective to detective, but the Marysville police never forgot her. As DNA advanced, they were able to get a DNA sample that didn't belong to Jennifer, individual A, but they didn't have anyone to compare the sample to. The Marysville Police Department eventually partnered with Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs. They would use genetic geology and publicly offered profiles to find a potential list of suspects. One of these suspects had already been on their radar for years. The suspect had been a person of interest Jennifer had talked to on one of the chat lines, and the suspect had sent a letter to Jennifer just prior to her death. But when the suspect had previously interviewed earlier in the investigation, he denied ever knowing or having contact with Jennifer. With this advanced DNA analysis, they could get a search warrant for the suspect's DNA. With the warrant, he volunteered his DNA willingly, and it was an exact match. He was arrested in November 2022 with first-degree murder. In November, the Marysville Police Department held a press conference announcing that they had arrested a suspect, a 52-year-old man. They did not reveal his name at that time. The police said that they are still getting all of the pieces together. In this press conference, they said that the letter had wording that implied that they had met before. The suspect lived only 3 miles from Jennifer's mother's house, but they didn't know if they had met in the past while Jennifer visited her mother. The suspect would have been at 28 years old at the time of Jennifer's murder. They said that the suspect had used his right to remain silent and that they may never get an answer to the motive. Since the murder, he has worked and lived as a hermit, and he is not suspected in any other murders, nor evidence that he's connected to any other crimes. After 24 years, they could tell Jennifer's mother that they had found who did this. The press conference revealed that Jennifer's mother was extremely emotional. She cried and was very thankful for the work that was put into her case. Jennifer's father passed away in 2013. There may never be answers as to why this happened, but the family can hopefully find some justice for Jennifer. The suspect is currently being held on charges of first-degree murder in Snohomish County Jail. At this time, there are no further announcements on the next court dates or when his identity will be released to the public. Susan Tice had just moved to downtown Toronto, Canada. The 45-year-old, recently divorced social worker had been alone in the morning of August 17, 1983. Her 4 children were at a family gathering, one that Susan intended to go to as well. But when she didn't show up, her family grew concerned. Her brother-in-law was the one to drive down and check up on Susan. He first knocked on the front door, but no one answered. He went around to the back of the home, and his concern grew immediately when he discovered the back door had been left ajar. The home had been ransacked. He discovered Susan's lifeless body in her bedroom. She'd been stabbed multiple times and assaulted. The Toronto Police Department investigated the murder. However, there was little evidence to go on. A neighbor claimed to have heard screaming around 1:30 a.m. the previous night, but didn't investigate. The same neighbor also claimed to have heard someone walking around in the alleyway behind their stretch of houses, indicating there may have been a prowler looking for unlocked homes to break into. When asked for an update on the investigation, Toronto PD was quoted as saying, "We have no suspect at all. A crushing blow in a violent murder." 4 months later, on December 20th, 1983, 22-year-old Erin Gilmore was discovered by her boyfriend in her apartment and stabbed to death. Erin lived in an upstairs apartment above her job working for a clothing store. She locked the door to the store at 9 p.m. and was supposed to quickly change and head out for a holiday party. When her boyfriend showed up, he noticed her apartment door was ajar, which initially he thought Erin was going to pop out at any moment. He waited for a second, but she never came to the door, so he decided to go up. The apartment was dark. He called out to her, but she didn't answer. In her bedroom, he noticed something under the duvet in her bed. He pulled it back and found Erin's body, a horrific discovery that he would never forget. Erin was also assaulted, and the window of the crime had been narrow. Erin had closed the store, gone up to her apartment, and her boyfriend came over 20 minutes after the store closed. Investigators hypothesized that Erin might have been stalked and the killer may have already been in her apartment when she finished her shift. Erin's father was a prominent businessman in the Toronto area, and the investigation was put under considerable scrutiny for an arrest. But despite an exhaustive search, no suspect was found. Eventually, both cases would go cold, but law enforcement had one thing: DNA evidence left behind by the killer. The cases were linked in 2000, when cold case detectives were cataloging old crimes and uploading DNA samples to a provincial database. Despite the crimes being in relatively close proximity, both in location and time and similar circumstances, the cases had never been connected. While this brought renewed hopes of solving the case, the new DNA lead didn't lead to any arrest for another 15 years. When the Golden State Killer was arrested in 2018, thanks to genetic genealogy, Erin's younger brother, Sean, reached out to the Toronto Cold Case Unit to ask if the same technology could be used to find Erin's killer. They reached out to Othram Labs in Texas, and they started working on the DNA profile left at Susan and Erin's crime scenes. Initially, there wasn't a lot of hope. They were using GeneMatch, which relies on people volunteering their DNA from services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe to build family trees. And the pool the suspect's DNA was from was incredibly vast, indicating that not a lot of people from his family had done any genetic testing. They had more than 3,000 names to go through. As they got closer to narrowing down the pool, they would eventually serve 61-year-old Joseph George Sutherland with a warrant requesting his DNA. His DNA was a match. After 39 years, Toronto police were able to make an official arrest in the cool case murders of both Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore. In 1983, Sutherland was 22 years old and had moved to Toronto from Moosonee, Ontario. He lived there for only a few months before the first murder. He moved back to Moosonee in the early 2000s, where he lived since. He had married, divorced, and had children. For the last decade, he worked for child welfare services in the area. He had no criminal history at the time of his arrest. He has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was arrested without incident. The arresting detective claimed that Sutherland knew the arrest was coming and had seemed to expect their arrival. That same detective also stated that they would be going through old cold cases to see if there were more victims connected to Sutherland. He's being held in custody while he awaits further court proceedings. It was on January 24, 1980, when 23-year-old Mary, who went by her middle name Robin, Walter, was found fatally shot in her home. Robin was married, a new mother, as well as a nursing student in Barton County, Kansas. Law enforcement went to the home when neighbors reported hearing several gunshots nearby, and it was then discovered that Robin's body was inside. Detectives canvassed the area and quickly learned of a neighbor, Stephen Hanks, who soon became a lead suspect in the murder case. However, there hadn't been enough evidence to arrest him, and he was eventually released. Hanks was arrested and charged with another crime in 1981 when he broke into a co-worker's home. He was charged with sexual assault, battery, robbery, and burglary. He had stalked this victim for months and attacked her in her home on 2 separate occasions. He served a decade behind bars for this and was released in 1993. Robin's case eventually went cold and became Kansas' oldest cold case murder. It had been reopened and reinvestigated over the decades, but nothing notable came up. In April 2022, the case was reassigned to Detective Sergeant Adam Hales, who had restarted the investigation from the very beginning. Around the same time he was assigned the case, he also contracted COVID-19 and was isolated at home with the case, giving him ample time to go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. In the case files, he noticed there were some irregularities with some of the witness statements, and he hasn't revealed exactly what he found in the evidence box. But he found something that led him to believe that there was more evidence connecting Hanks to the murder than was originally thought. The new evidence was enough to request a DNA sample, and from there, they were able to positively connect Stephen Hanks to the 1980 murder of Robin Walter. Stephen Hanks was arrested in early December 2022 and was charged with second-degree murder. Hanks is now 68 years old. Robin Walter's parents, husband, and sister weren't able to see the arrest as they are now deceased. Robin's daughter has said that she forgave her mother's killer years ago. In the summer of 1984, for women lived their worst nightmare. Starting June 3, 1984, a 25-year-old woman identified as Jane Doe No. 1 in Bloomsfield, Connecticut woke up to a man standing over her bed. He had entered through a screen door to her apartment. He put a gun to her head and told her he would shoot her and her roommate who was sleeping in the other room. It was dark and he blindfolded her. Then he sexually assaulted her before looking for valuables and getting a beer from the fridge. She reported this to the authorities and a sexual assault kit and other evidence were collected. Jane Doe No. 2, a 30-year-old woman living in Middletown, Connecticut, was attacked on June 26, 1984. The man came in through a sliding door into an apartment, held a gun to the woman's head, blindfolded her, sexually assaulted her. He then robbed her and spent a while in the home before leaving. She also reported this to the police, getting evidence collected and a sexual assault kit taken. On July 24, 1984, in Windsor, Connecticut, 26-year-old woman woke up to a man in her apartment, and again he did the exact same thing he did to the other two victims. This was again reported and all the evidence was collected. On July 24, 1984, a 24-year-old mother was asleep in her bed with her 2-year-old daughter when she woke up to a man holding a gun to her head. He began to touch her. She then asked if she could put her daughter in another room. He blindfolded her and guided the mother holding her child to another room. She put her daughter to bed. He then took her back to her bedroom and sexually assaulted her. He stayed around the home to look for valuables and something to eat before leaving. The daughter was never harmed. All of these women have had their names kept secret. They all have similar stories and they didn't see much, it was dark, and they were blindfolded very quickly. Authorities in these 4 places were able to notice a pattern in all these women's stories, and in 1990 they would connect all 4 cases to a single DNA source. The same man had attacked these women. Unfortunately, there was no match in federal or state databases, and through the years they were never able to find a match. The Connecticut Cold Case Unit used genetic genealogy to try and find a match for these women's attacker. Using publicly available genealogy information that had been uploaded to public databases, investigators were able to narrow down a suspect. The suspect's name was Michael Sharp, and he was a former CEO of a charter school organization. On November 9, 2020, investigators were able to obtain a DNA sample from garbage that had been left on the curb of Sharp's home. The DNA matched the 4 sexual assault kits from 1984. They were able to get a search warrant and obtain a DNA sample directly from Sharp, which also was an exact match. On November 17, 2020, Sharp was arrested for kidnapping in the first degree with a firearm. He was arrested for kidnapping because in 1984, the statute of limitations for sexual assault was only 5 years, but that was not the case for kidnapping charges. The Connecticut Cold Case Unit got a call from all 4 of these women to tell them that they had not been forgotten and their attacker had been arrested. Sharp was finally charged with 8 counts of first-degree kidnapping with a firearm, 2 counts for each woman. In 2021, he pleaded not guilty and he turned down a plea bargain for 25 years in jail, going forward to trial. On November 2, 2022, a jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts after less than an hour of deliberations. Michael Sharp now faces 25 to 100 years in prison when he's sentenced in January 2023. The 4 women, after the conviction, revealed their names to the public. No more Jane Doe, Linda, Shelley, Kathy, and Roseanne finally held justice for the horrific attacks they survived in 1984. Susanna Jane Lampl, known as Susie, was born on May 3, 1961, in Cheltenham, England, to parents Paul and Diana. Named after actress Susanna York, she had 3 siblings, Richard, Tamsin, and Lizzie. Susie was eloquent and ambitious, with her father describing her as enormously charismatic. Before embarking on a career in real estate, she worked as a beautician on the QE2 cruise ship. Eventually, she became a negotiator for the estate agency firm Sturgis. In her role, she gained new clients and showed them available properties. Upon securing the job, she wrote in her diary, "I'm hired on the spot." Living and working in London, Susie spent her free time with her boyfriend, Adam Leogard, as well as family and friends. On Saturday, July 26, 1986, she enjoyed a social evening, during which a photograph captured her smiling and having fun. The following day, she visited her mother, discussing her mom's theater plans and Susie's recent windsurfing trip. Her mother, Diana, expressed concern that Susie might be overdoing things and not taking enough time to relax. Susie reassured her, stating that life was meant to be lived. It was a beautiful summer day in London as the bustling capital awoke to its daily routine, and Susie began her day. She rose just before 8 a.m. in her flat on Disraeli Road in Putney. Her roommate Nick said goodbye to her before he set off for work. She told him to have a good day and that she would see him in the evening when they both got home. She got dressed, putting on her gray skirt, dark jackets and heels, and at around 8:40 a.m., Susie left her flat and drove to the office, just 10 minutes away in the company car. After getting her morning work done, the 25-year-old estate agent left her Fulham office at 12:40 p.m., as she had an appointment to show a man, called Mr. Kipper, in her diary, around a house, 37 Shorells Road. This was routine and part of the day-to-day normalities of Susie's job. 5 minutes later, her car was seen parked on Stevenage Road by a woman who lived in the house opposite. Her car was partly parked across the entrance to a garage. At 12:50, she was seen by a passerby standing by the gate of 37 Shorells Road, and it appeared as though she was waiting for somebody. At 2 p.m., her car had been seen by a taxi driver still parked on Stevenage Road, and by 3:30, the woman who lived opposite where her car was parked returned home, and Susie's car was still there. By that time, Susie still hadn't come back to the office and had missed her other scheduled appointments. Her manager Mark became increasingly worried, and so he and a colleague headed to 37 Sherald Road to see if she had accidentally become locked in the house. But she wasn't there. They began ringing local hospitals to see if she had been involved in an accident, but this too turned up nothing. Mark called her mother saying, "I don't want you to worry too much. Susie has not returned." Diana explained that she hadn't seen Susie either, and then she called her husband Paul to tell him that Susie's boss had been in touch and that Susie hadn't come back. Her parents were immediately concerned by this out-of-character behavior. At 5:30 p.m., the call was made to police, and she was officially reported as a missing person. By 9 p.m., officers were out on the streets searching for Susie's vehicle. At 1 minute past 10, her Ford Fiesta was found by investigators. It was unlocked and still sat on Stevenage Road. The seat had been pushed back and was not in Susie's usual driving position. Her purse containing 15 pounds in cash was still in the car, but the keys for 37 Sherells Road and her own personal keys were not there. To find and follow as many leads as possible, police began speaking to the people who were in the area at the same time that Susie was. At around 1 p.m., Harry Rigoland, who lived in the house next door to 37 Sherells Road, heard the front door close. He looked out of his window and saw a woman with a man who stood at around 5'9". Harry described the man as immaculately dressed in a suit. At the same time, another man came walking down Charles Road and noticed that the man was holding a bottle of champagne. This witness was able to provide a description of the man he had seen, which produced a photo fit. Harry Rigoland was also able to provide police with a photo fit of the man, but the evidence presented was conflicting. A friend of Susie's, Barbara Whitfield, was cycling down Fulham Palace Road at 2:45 p.m. She was adamant that she had seen Susie in her car driving in the opposite direction with a man in the front seat. This was contrary to the witness who said she had seen her car still parked on Stevenage Road that afternoon and that it hadn't moved during that time. A van driver said he had seen her car driving erratically with a female driver and a male passenger close to Charles Road. The pair appeared to be arguing, and so erratic was the driving, the van driver had to swerve to avoid them. Her comb and lipstick were still in her office, and the dress that she had been working on in her flat was still on the sewing machine. There was nothing to indicate that she had decided to up and leave. The public and media interest in Susie's case was huge and immediate, and tips began to pour in from members of the public, and they needed to be investigated in case any of them led to Susie. The tips were put onto a card indexing system with more than 26,000 cards being held. One issue was that the photo that had been put out of Susie was not as up-to-date as it could have been, as it showed her with dark into. There were so many leads to follow. The police were overstretched as the enormity of the task continued to mount. They were able to find and speak to all her previous clients in her diary, all except Mr. Kipper. They traced the address that he had given to the estate agents, and there was nobody at the property of that name. After her disappearance, her parents made a TV appeal. But, as the days continued to pass, there was still no sign of Susie Lampl. When looking into her personal life, there had been one man in particular that had left Susie on edge and nervous. She told her parents that he had been pursuing her by calling her and sending her flowers and asking to go into business with her. He had wanted to take her out, which her parents attempted to dissuade her from. She assured them that she would be fine, telling them she could handle it. Unfortunately, Susie didn't give her parents enough information that could help identify this unknown man. Shortly before her disappearance, Susie had talked to her uncle about this man too, expressing her anger over his refusal to take no for an answer. It had now been 12 weeks since Susie had last been seen, and in an attempt to generate any new leads, her case would be featured on the show Crime Watch. Crime Watch showed a reconstruction of Susie's last known movements to try and jog anyone's memory who may have seen her that day. Despite this new appeal, Susie Lampl still hadn't been found. For months after Susie had gone missing, her parents formed the Susie Lampl Trust in December of 1986 with their mission statement saying, "Our mission is to reduce the risk of violence and aggression through campaigning, education, and support." The pioneering work of the Susie Lampl Trust worked on issues surrounding stalking and personal safety. Paul said that they were determined to do something that would be useful, something appropriate. What came out was something that we would call personal safety. That started because Susie disappeared in the workplace. So we started working on personal safety for people at work. In June 1987, her mother told a television interviewer that her hope of finding Susie safe and well had faded. In October that year, the police announced that the inquiry into what had happened to Susie would begin to scale down, but the file on her case would continue to remain open. In 1992, Paul and Diana Lampl were awarded OBEs for their inspirational campaigning work with the Susie Lampl Trust. On the 7th anniversary of Susie's disappearance, in 1994, her father signed the required legal papers, and she was officially declared dead. He said, "It marks a finality. It releases us. It allows us to think of Susie as dead. We loved her very much, but we need to rebuild our lives." Her mother Diana said, "We knew fairly soon that we would not see her again. Felt awfully final. I knew Susie could not have borne the desperation of being locked up as Stephanie Slater was able to, and she had no reason to go missing." Stephanie Slater was an estate agent who was kidnapped by a killer called Michael Sams, who had already abducted and murdered a woman named Julie Dart. Stephanie Slater was held captive for 8 days in a makeshift coffin and repeatedly sexually assaulted. After a ransom had been paid, she was freed. Sams was later arrested after a huge manhunt and remains in prison to this day. In 1995, crime writer Christopher Barry D. published a book called Unmasking Mr. Kipper, claiming that Michael Sams was responsible for Susie's disappearance. But investigators discounted this theory. Controversy emerged when a book called The Susie Lampl Story, written by Andrew Stephen, was published. The book presented a side of Susie as being lonely, unfulfilled sexually, and dealing with insecurities, contrary to what her parents had said about her, that she was confident and happy in her relationship with her boyfriend. The Lampres hit back at the book saying, "That book made us lose all the nice things we could remember about our daughter. We had to rebuild our memories." In 1996, a stained glass window was dedicated to her at her parents' church in Richmond. In December 1999, Detective Superintendent Sean Sawyer took over the investigation. He requested that another Scotland Yard department look into Susie's case. The review was headed by Detective Chief Inspector Barry Webb, who had conducted the review into the unsolved murder of Crime Watch host and news presenter Jill Dando. Susie's mother said, "We are delighted that the police are looking into it in this way. The case has remained unsolved for 13 years, and any review of new and old information can only help. Came as a complete surprise. We knew they were planning several different lines to bring in, but this is much bigger than we expected. It is nice to know where we are going." The review examined the decisions taken in the investigation and looked at the lines of inquiry and the evidence that had been gathered so far. In May 2000, the police officially reopened the inquiry into what had happened to Susie Lampl. Following this, 25 tips came through on the phones. They began to put the numerous information cards that they had gathered about Susie's case onto a computer system. Then, the police discovered something. Estate agents from Fulham said that a man had come into their offices using the name Mr. Kipper. To try and generate more leads, police issued the more up-to-date photograph of Susie with the blonder hair as opposed to the dark-haired photo that had been used when she first went missing. A new witness came forward. A man had been out jogging in Fulham that day and slammed on the brakes before someone in the car began repeatedly beeping the horn. He said it appeared that the woman in the car was laughing, but also said she could have been screaming. What was also interesting was that the steering wheel was on the left-hand side of the vehicle, while cars in the United Kingdom have the steering wheel on the right. Despite the best efforts of the police, they were never able to find the BMW. In 2001, police announced that they would begin re-examining the remains of more than 800 unidentified people to see if any of them could be Susie Lampl. They would use DNA from Susie's parents and compare them to the DNA of the remains to try and find a match. The work was groundbreaking. The police and the Forensic Science Service had been developing the first DNA database, specifically for remains of unidentified people. Senior Officer Detective Chief Inspector Jim Dickey said, "We are looking at every body that has been found in the UK for the last 15 years that has not been identified, including possible suicides, bodies washed up on the shore, found in rivers or in undergrowth, or died in the street." But unfortunately, this, like all of the other leads, would go nowhere. Many years had now passed since Susie's disappearance, and in November 2002, the police took the unusual decision to name their prime suspect, someone they had questioned before, a convicted murderer and sex offender, John Cannon. John Cannon had been born in Sutton Coldfield to a middle-class family in 1954. He was born to former RAF Flight Lieutenant Cyril Cannon and his wife Sheila, and was the firstborn of their 3 children. At the age of 4, he was sent to a private school and would later brag about how he was able to charm one of his teachers into giving him the biscuits that she had brought in. According to a documentary, his mother, Sheila, adored him, but his relationship with his father was fraught. At the age of just 14 years old, John Cannon was convicted of a sex attack. He had attacked a woman in a phone box in Birmingham, and he would be placed on probation. He left school with only a few qualifications, and following a period in the Merchant Navy, he became a car dealer in Birmingham. Due to his notorious dishonesty, he would be given the nickname Billy Liar. In May 1978, John Cannon got married in Birmingham. In a documentary about John Cannon, reference was made to a horrifying series of sexual assaults committed shortly after. More than 20 women were attacked in 2 years, and police set about trying to catch who was responsible. The modus operandi was always the same. When a house in the area went up for sale, a man would go to the property and attack the female owner. John Cannon was not questioned, and nobody was arrested for the attacks. He began an affair with another woman, but when she told him that she would be spending Christmas with her ex-husband and children, he became consumed with jealousy, and she ended their relationship. He went to her house with a bottle of champagne, full of his usual charm. But after she let him inside, he pulled a gun on her. She tried to escape but fell down the stairs and was seriously injured. The police noted the incident as a domestic row, and she was taken to hospital to be treated for her injuries. Just 2 years after the wedding, and soon after the birth of their daughter, Cannan's marriage ended, and he would begin living in a bedsies in Birmingham. He would drink to excess and his finances would take a downward spiral. He started committing armed robberies, with the first being in a petrol station shop close to his home where he stole £260. But his crimes would soon take a far more sinister turn. He went into a knitwear shop and covered his face with a handkerchief. When he was approached by the shop assistant, he pulled a knife on her before leading her to the back room. He threatened that if she said a word, he would cut her up. Her baby was in the back room, and he also threatened that he would hurt her child if she didn't cooperate. He went through her bag and the cash box but didn't find a large amount of money. The shop assistant's mother then came into the shop and he held the knife to her too and told her to face the wall with her daughter. The mother was tied up before he turned his attention back to the shop assistant. He ordered her to strip before brutally raping her. He even did this after she told him that she was pregnant. After the attack, he fled the scene. In a desperate bid to avoid being caught, he shaved off the middle of his thick eyebrows. But this didn't work, and John Cannon was arrested. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison after entering a plea of guilty to charges of robbery and rape. He began his sentence in Bristol, where he was regularly attacked by fellow inmates due to the nature of his offending. As a result, he would be isolated from other prisoners for his own safety. The majority of his sentence would be served in Bristol, and he would then be moved to London. In January 1986, he was sent to a pre-release hostel attached to Wormwood Scrubs prison, which gave him more freedom during the day. He had begun working as a porter at a company hiring out theatrical props. Those who worked with him were unaware of the nature of his offending and said that he was incredibly successful with women and found it easy to get dates. He would often brag about his ways with women and claim to be dating an uptown woman called Susu. He also said that he was interested in buying a house in the Fulham area. Whilst at the prison hostel, John Cannon also had access to an expensive BMW and a red Sierra that he had borrowed from another prisoner. He would use the Sierra to visit Bournemouth, and on one of these trips during the May Day bank holiday, a woman called Sandra Court would disappear. She was 27 years old and worked as an insurance clerk. She had left the Steps nightclub and was last seen at around 3 a.m. on Downton Close. She had no shoes on, appeared to be intoxicated, and was just yards away from the front door. At 7 p.m. that day, her body was found in a ditch. The cause of death was strangulation. 10 days after Sandra's body was found, a letter was sent from Southampton to the police describing her death as an accident. The letter was anonymous. What was unusual is that it appeared to have been written by someone who was left-handed who had attempted to disguise it by using their right hand. Cannon was left-handed. In 2007, authors Christopher Berry D. and Robin Odell wrote a book on John Cannon and received letters from him, which gave police something to compare to the anonymous letter they had received with the handwriting, allegedly bearing a resemblance. Cannon was questioned by police following her murder, but was adamant that he didn't know Sandra at all and that he hadn't even been in the area at the time. But a parking ticket proved he had been in Bournemouth that day. But other than that, there was no other evidence to link him to her death, and so nothing further would come of it. On Friday, July 25th, John Cannon had served 5 years of his sentence, and he was officially released. That night, Susie had been out with her boyfriend. Adam and Susie had met at her flat and then got out to celebrate the end of the working week. They had a nice meal in a restaurant and discussed how their week had gone and what plans they had for the weekend. After the meal, they headed to the Prince of Wales pub for a drink. Whilst there, Susie was pickpocketed and several items, including her checkbook and cards, were stolen from her handbag. This was the same pub that John Cannon would often go into, and it was stated in a documentary that police had theorized that Cannon had been the one who had stolen from her that night. An anonymous caller telephoned her estate agents, saying they were a policeman and her stolen checkbook had been found. But that person was not a police officer. A police officer said that this had all the hallmarks of stalking. Just 3 days later, on July 25th, Susie Lampl would disappear. Just a few days after her disappearance, Kinnan went to Bristol and rented a flat there. He would frequent the Avon Gorge Hotel wine bar to meet women, and he would always have the Princess Suite costing £90 per night. He would always pay for the room in cash, and if that suite wasn't available, he wouldn't stay. The hotel was so close to his flat that spending that much money for a night there was unusual. He would later begin a relationship with ice skater Jilly Page. He had met her in the wine bar, and they had spent their time together drinking champagne and sharing stories. But the happiness was not to last. He would always tell her to use a false name when she booked into hotels and would also tell her not to disclose her location to friends or family. But she didn't do this and would always tell her parents where she was going. In 1990, a lead in Susie's case came in that would blow it wide open. A woman came forward and said that she and John Cannon had been driving along the M5 to Birmingham and that he had pulled over to the side of the road by the disused Norton Barracks in Worcestershire. He gestured to an area and said that that was the kind of place where Susie Lampl could be buried. He then put his hands around her neck and said, "This is how she could have died." The woman with this information was Cannon's ex-girlfriend, Jilly Page. As they headed over to the barracks, he allegedly said to her, "Do you want to go where Susie went?" He also allegedly told her that his nickname in prison was Kipper, matching the name of the elusive Mr. Kipper from Susie's diary. The last time they met each other, he had told Julie to pretend that she was his wife when checking in and to use a fake name. But she hadn't done this. She said he hit the roof when he found out. Following the end of their relationship and when the truth about Cannon's offending was brought to light, Jilly had a nervous breakdown. Despite the promise of the potential Norton Barracks lead, it was decided that the evidence was not strong enough to justify launching a huge search of such a vast area that required a massive amount of manpower and money. In November 1999, the Lampls received a tip-off. The information came in through a phone call and a letter. The anonymous source, the officers kept the Lamp clues up to date with how the search was progressing and if they had got anywhere. Unfortunately, the search turned up nothing. Susie wasn't found and her devastated family were back at square one. Just 9 months before Julie Page came forward to the police in 1990, Cannon had been arrested on suspicion of rape again, this time of a housewife in Reading. She had been sitting in her car when he got in and forced her into the back before driving to an industrial estate and savagely raping her. He then calmly walked away and flagged down a taxi. The victim was left completely traumatized and was unable to pick him out of a lineup. He had affairs with several women at one time, including a female solicitor who had previously represented him. They had a relationship that lasted a year, but this too would fall apart, and he would make allegations about her to the Law Society and the police. September 1987. As part of his ploy to meet more women, he filmed a video for a dating agency using the fake name John Peterson. He was well-dressed, eloquent, and charming, but in spite of this, the dating agency were left so uneasy about his video that they decided not to release it. The woman who conducted the interview with him would later say that she was grateful her husband had been there in the office that day, and that she was thankful she hadn't been left alone with him. Just 2 days after filming the dating agency video, Connan had attempted to abduct a woman from her car at gunpoint, but she had successfully fought him off. She would later be able to positively identify him, but his sinister crime spree did not stop there. October 8, 1987, Shirley Banks, a textiles manager from Clifton, was out shopping at a Debenham store in Bristol. She had only just got married and was getting ready to meet her husband, Richard, and the pair would be going out for dinner. She failed to turn up. Her husband visited the local pubs to see if she was there, but she was nowhere to be found. The next morning, Richard phoned her office to see if she had gone in. They told him that 15 minutes earlier, at 9 a.m., one of her colleagues had received a call from her. She explained that she was ill and wouldn't be in that day. Richard called the police. An extensive search revealed nothing. Shirley Banks had disappeared without a trace. 3 weeks later, in Leamington Spa, an arrest was made. A man had just attempted to rape 2 women in a shop before being chased off. He was found hiding in the toilets of a car showroom. John Cannon was finally in custody. His garage was searched where Shirley Banks's Mini was found. He had attempted to repaint it and change the vehicle number. His car was also searched, and it would be a clue in his briefcase that sealed his fate. It was the tax disc for Shirley's car and a fake gun. He was adamant that she had never been inside his flat, but one piece of evidence would unravel this lie. In his flat, a document was found that had Shirley's fingerprint on it. John Cannon had abducted her and held her captive for 18 hours. He had sexually assaulted and then killed her. He was subsequently charged with Shirley Banks' murder. 6 months later, on Easter Sunday 1988, human remains were found in Somerset by a couple walking their dog in a remote area called Dead Woman's Ditch. It was identified using 5 pieces of jewelry belonging to Shirley Banks. Her skull had been crushed with a rock. The fake number plate that John Cannon had put on Shirley's car also raised suspicions. It had been changed to SLP 386S, with some thinking that the SLP was a reference to none other than Susie Lampl. However, there was no computer link between the police investigating the murder of Shirley Banks and those looking into Susie Lampl's disappearance. The first ones to make the link was the media and Susie Lampl's mother and father, especially with the photo fit saying it looked like Cannon. Police officers traveled to Bristol to talk to him. He told the questioning officer that Shirley Banks had been killed by a Bristol businessman. And when he was asked if he knew who that was, Cannon replied, "I've met him." Retired Detective Chief Inspector Michael Barley said that he began to believe Cannon was the mystery man who had been pursuing Susie Lampl and pressuring her to go into business with him. One of them asked why he had chosen SLP for the new number plate, and if he understood why it stood out to them. He said he did. When asked to elaborate on this, he said he knew it could have been interpreted to mean Susie Lampl. He said that he had purchased the car in Bristol for £100 from this mystery businessman, and that the man he had bought it off was in a lot of trouble. He said that this man was responsible for the murders of Shirley Banks, Susie Lampl, and another woman. The officer asked if that man was him. He said yes, then began repeatedly saying no, no, no. He became very emotional, and the interview was halted. One of the interviewing police officers was feeling positive about his initial confession to being the man in question, but the other officer was not sure. He thought Cannon had simply made a mistake in saying yes. After recommencing the interview, the moment had gone. Cannon confessed to nothing. April 1989. His lawyer refuted claims of a connection between him and Susie. The interviews that followed would go nowhere. Cannon would always find out the first name of the officer interviewing him and make a point of calling them that throughout the interview. He would attempt to gain control of the interviews and try and become the one asking questions. One of the investigators would later say that Cannon was not as intelligent as he believed he was. He was examined by psychiatrists, one of whom said that he could dispose of a human life with the same amount of emotion as someone throwing away a toffee wrapper. In April 1989, Scotland Yard said it had no evidence that linked Cannon and Susie. May 2000. John Cannon would be questioned. Detective Inspector Stuart Alt would lead the questioning. He would say in a documentary that the difference between Cannon on the dating video and the Cannon in front of him were two completely different people. He had gained weight and was no longer the smart and well-put-together man he once was. He had researched how Cannon had behaved in his previous interviews and was able to preempt any attempt he could make to gain control of the interview. Following the interview, the police decided they would search Shirley Banks's deposition site, Dead Woman's Ditch. Based on the fake number plate that he had put on Shirley's car, SLP 386S, it could have referred to a grid reference on an ordnance survey map, which was close to Dead Woman's Ditch. In spite of their best efforts, no trace through. A witness came forward saying they had seen a man peering through the window of Susie's estate agent's office just prior to her leaving. The witness said that the man bore a resemblance to John Cannon. The police put their case to the Crown Prosecution Service, also known as the CPS. The police and Susie's parents gave a statement about the CPS's decision. Later that month, a story about Susie's case would hit the headlines. It was reported that a car, the Red Sierra, had been seized, and that it could potentially be linked to her kidnapping. The car had been stored at a dealership in North London for several years. A police spokesman said a further witness has come forward with new information, which officers view as significant. The witness told police that he lent a motor vehicle to one of the key suspects at the time that Susie Lampl disappeared. The car has been traced and is currently being forensically examined. Officers were hopeful that since scientific techniques and testing had come such a long way since her disappearance, this would give them the lead they were looking for. Susie's mother said, "We are very pleased with the find, but we are trying not to be too pleased or excited. But it does look like a very significant move, and we are hopeful." In the car, they found 2 human hairs, one on the headrest and one in the footwell. DNA testing revealed that there was a possibility that the hairs belonged to none other than Sandra Court, who had been murdered after a night out. The probability of it being Sandra's hair was around 40,000 to 1, which was not significant enough to put in front of a jury. Sadly, this was another lead that would go nowhere. In 2008, it was announced that the police were looking into another theory, a potential link between Susie's disappearance and the serial killer, Steve Wright. Wright, nicknamed the Suffolk Strangler, was convicted and given a whole life order for the murders of 5 sex workers in just 1 fortnight in 2006. Susie's father, Paul, said that he'd been contacted by the Metropolitan Police regarding the potential link between his daughter's case and Wright. Scotland Yard had been in touch with Suffolk Police to discuss it further, but emphasized that investigating any potential link was routine, and there was currently nothing suggesting that Wright had been involved in Susie's disappearance. Steve Wright and Susie Lampl had actually known each other. They had first met on the cruise liner that Susie had worked on in the early 1980s. Wright would later open a pub in Brixton, and they would meet up with each other. Steve Wright's ex-wife spoke to the police and would later tell the Daily Mail that when Susie disappeared, Wright had had shore leave. She also said, "I'm sure Steve used the word kipper as slang for face." She also said that Wright had refused to admit that he even knew Susie when news of her going missing became national news. She said, "I really want him to tell us if he killed Susie for my peace of mind, for her family's sake." According to a report in Suffolk Live, Wright's father had even questioned his possible involvement in Susie's case after he had found a photograph of the pair of them together in the 80s. In 2012, police ruled Steve Wright out of the disappearance of Susie Lampl. In 2021, Susie's brother Richard said he wanted Steve Wright to be questioned by the police regarding her case. He said, "I don't see any reason why police couldn't speak to Wright about Susie's murder. They're trying to solve another case and are probably concentrating on that one. Whether it's Cannon or Wright, I don't know. What's difficult is not knowing where she is. It would be lovely to find her, to have somewhere we could scatter her ashes. If Wright's dad thought he was a possibility, it would be good to know whether he was around at the time in Fulham and Putney. I think that would be the interesting thing if he could be placed at the scene." In a 2019 interview, Cannon said, "I am concerned that the police will use Susie's disappearance to undermine my parole prospects. My concern is that smearing me has become the rule, not the exception. I had no involvement in the disappearance of Susie Lampl." Adding, the police were determined to use me as a convenient peg to hang the disappearance upon. Not all are in agreement as to whether or not John Cannon is involved. David Vitichetti, a former Scotland Yard detective, said not a shred of evidence linked Cannon to Susie's case. He wrote a book called Finding Susie after 5 years of research and said, "From speaking to former officers who worked on the 2 previous investigations, I have found it widely accepted within the police that there is no evidence to support John Cannon ever knowing Susie Lampl or ever even meeting her. He had been investigating the case in a self-funded capacity for several years, and said that one piece of evidence in particular implied that Susie hadn't gone to the viewing. The set of keys for the house were found at the Sturgis office, and he said that any second set of keys for the property would have had the same key ring, suggesting that she had not gone to the appointment. He also said that he had spoken to the nephew of Harry Rigland, who had lived next door, and had seen a woman and a man at 37 Sherrills Road. He said that Rigland's nephew had said his uncle had never explicitly said that it was Susie he had seen. It is Vitisetti's belief that Mr. Kipper was actually invented by Susie and didn't exist, giving her an excuse to run errands. In a statement, he said, "I am assisting the Metropolitan Police's murder review group with information relating to the 1986 disappearance of estate agent Susie Lampl. I have spoken to the Lampl family to make them aware of these developments." My findings have led me to uncover an entirely different narrative to the one presented by the police, which I am now providing to the Met along with the evidence to support it. I do not believe Cannon was involved in either Susie's disappearance or what I suspect was her subsequent murder. Retired Detective Chief Superintendent Jim Dickey had worked on Susie's case for 6 years, and he disagreed, saying, "I still firmly believe he is responsible for her killing. There is a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to him. I don't believe it's Steve Wright. If you look at his offending profile, it's all prostitutes. It's all geographically in the same area. I said some years ago that Wright is not in the frame. His offending profile just does not match at all." He also said, "Cannon is still a suspect for the disappearance and murder of Susie Lampl." Susie's brother Richard would say about Cannon, "If it was Cannon who did it, then he's coming out on parole soon. I really don't want him to kill again. You always worry when they are released. That's the worry. If he's released and then he wants to kill again, however, that's not going to bring my sister back. But it would be lovely to have somewhere we could place her, rather than where whoever killed her has left her. It would be one of our family's dreams to find her." Susie's mother Diana believed that Cannon was responsible, but added, "The evidence is circumstantial rather than forensic." October 29, 2018. It was announced that police were searching a house in Sutton Coldfield, the same house that John Cannon's mother had once owned. Susie's brother Richard said finding her body would mean so much to her family and allow them to have a proper goodbye. He said, "It has been a long time and we've had our expectations raised before, but it would be nice if we could finally have some closure." The search team included around 15 officers and staff from the West Midlands Police Force and the Metropolitan Police Force, alongside an archaeologist. The police were looking at where the former garage had stood, and particularly the concrete underneath, said the house's current owner, Philip Carey. He also said that the house had been searched before in 2003 and 2004. At the same time the searches were being carried out, Jim Dickey was interviewed by the BBC. "We looked at John Conan and other suspects. We eliminated all the other suspects, and John Conan was firmly in the frame for Susie's abduction and murder, and he still remains the main suspect to this day. We uncovered quite a lot of new evidence. We pursued some of the old leads, and there's no doubt that John Conahan was in Fulham on the day Susie went missing. He was Mr. Kipper. If you look at the photo fit of Mr. Kipper, that was John Cannon. His modus operandi, he's responsible for the murder of Shirley Banks in Bristol. He's raped a number of women. He's abducted a number of women. It all ties in with John Conahan being the primary suspect." Conan's solicitor said Mr. Conahan hopes that the search of his mother's former home will conclude swiftly so as to bring an end to speculation as to his involvement in this matter. The search would span almost 2 weeks, but unfortunately, Susie was not found. In 2019, another search was carried out, this time in Pershore. On the July 3rd, a police cordon was put up along the B4084, and a dog unit and digger were brought in. In a statement, the Susie Lampl Trust said, "We hope that the current investigations will be successful and provide some resolution to Susie's case." On the July 19th, the police announced that the search had revealed no new evidence. 35 years on from her disappearance, the police said that her case remained active and urged anyone with information to come forward. Detective Chief Inspector Rebecca Reeves said, "Whether you saw something that you thought was unconnected at the time, or you felt under pressure to protect someone you know, it is not too late. The passage of time has not weakened our determination to seek justice and get the answers that the Lampl family continue to wait for. They have always been supportive of our efforts to make progress in the investigation, and they have shown remarkable strength despite the immense sadness they have endured over the years." In June 2022, it was reported that a sample had been taken from a smudged fingerprint on Susie's abandoned car, and as science and technology had advanced, there was a possibility of extracting a DNA profile. Retired Detective Superintendent Jim Dickey said, "I'm unaware if the DNA sample from the fingerprint has been progressed, and whether there is sufficient evidence to test it without destroying it. My advice from the experts was scientific advances may improve sometime in the future, and DNA science may develop to enable testing without destroying it. I'm unaware if this is still the case or a review and test have taken place, and if so, what the result was. Certainly, up to 2 or 3 years ago, this had not taken place. John Cannon is currently imprisoned at HMP Full Sutton, a top security prison in East Yorkshire. He should be eligible for parole in 2024. But the then Chief Justice Lane had said Cannon would probably never be safe to release. He has always denied any involvement in the case of Susie Lampl and denied the claims of his ex-girlfriend, Gilly Page. He wrote to certain news saying, "May I please assure you that whilst it is perfectly true that I did give ice skater Gilly Page a lift from Bristol to Birmingham, where both our families live, I did not at any time say that I had raped and killed Miss Lampl." Following a stroke, Cannon became disabled and required a wheelchair. His health continued to decline, and it was reported in June 2022 that he was receiving palliative care. Retired Detective Chief Superintendent Jim Dickey said, "The indications are that his time is limited. He has not got much quality of life. There is clearly not going to be any judicial process in the future whatever information he gives up before departing this world. There is an opportunity for Cannon to cleanse his soul and above all give solace to the Lampl family. It is a chance for him to give them closure and bury Susie with dignity at a time and place of their choosing." He added, "By telling the truth, there would be no sanction for Canaan on this earth now, but it could cleanse his conscience and allow him to make peace with God. Can't be easy to live with what he has done." In the years that followed Susie Lampl's disappearance, the public and media interest in her case has never dampened. For years, Susie's mother and father were inundated with tips about where Susie could be, with all of them being handed to the police. In March 2003, Diana Lampl suffered 2 strokes and was then diagnosed with Alzheimer's, resulting in her requiring specialist care. Paul would visit her every day and would go on to write a book about his experiences of navigating this new life following her Alzheimer's diagnosis. On August 18, 2011, following a stroke, she passed away in hospital at the age of 75. Speaking in 2016, Paul Lampl said, "I don't have very much hope, though I will find out what happened. I miss Susie more now. I think the older I get, I miss her. I particularly remember a conversation when Diana was chiding her for doing too much, and she said, 'Come on, Mom. Life is for living.'" Paul Lampl had been battling Parkinson's disease for several years, and on June 12, 2018, he passed away in his sleep with his 3 surviving children by his bedside. Paul and Diana both passed before ever finding out what had happened to their beloved daughter. The work of the Susie Lampl Trust has been nothing short of incredible. Over the past 30 years, the Trust has helped to train more than 50,000 people, set up the National Stalking Helpline, successfully led the campaign for private hire vehicle licensing in London, and helped campaign for the Protection from Harassment Acts in 1997. Paul and Diana fought endlessly for their daughter's name to be remembered and to make an impact on personal safety and anti-stalking advocacy. They will forever be remembered for their determination, stoicism, and grace in dealing with Susie's disappearance. The impact of Susie Lampl's disappearance has been felt by so many people. It is the hope of those that knew and loved her that she will one day be found, so she can be laid to rest properly, and that whoever is responsible for what happened to her will finally be brought to justice. If you would like to know more about the work of the Susie Lampl Trust, we have left a link to their website in the description box. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Susie Lampl, please contact the relevant authorities. On September 12, 1976, the tranquility of Woodland, Baltimore was disrupted by a horrific discovery. On Dogwood Road, near Lorraine Park Cemetery, a pedestrian going about their morning routine found the body of a young woman wrapped in a sheet. Shocked by the find, they quickly called the Baltimore County Police Department to the scene. Upon arrival, police determined that the young woman's head had been covered with 2 bandanas and a grass seed bag. Investigators concluded that she had been strangled, and the autopsy later revealed seeds lodged in her throat, believed to have contributed to her death. The girl had also been sexually assaulted before being dumped near the cemetery. Her hands had been crudely tied behind her back with cloth and a rope. At the autopsy, the young woman's body revealed a frightening clue: chlorpromazine. This medication is a sedative. At the time, it had been used to treat schizophrenia. According to reports, a large amount of the drug was found in her system, which signaled to police that she'd been drugged, assaulted, and strangled. Person responsible had likely given her the drug to seduce her before launching the attack. In the report, the medical examiner noted that the girl was likely between the ages of 15–30 years old, possibly white or Hispanic with brown wavy hair and brown eyes. Despite the initial shock and outcry that the case garnered, no one stepped forward to identify her, leading investigators to call her the Woodland Jane Doe. In news reports, the police noted that the girl's teeth were in excellent condition, and she also had a crudely done tattoo on her right arm. The tattoo was believed to have been the initials JP, JS, JD, JB, SP, SS, SD, or SB. The seed sac that covered her head read Farm Bureau Grass Seed, Lexington, Massachusetts, and was traced back to a Buffalo, New York manufacturer. According to the manufacturer, this seed bag was only sold in 5 places across Massachusetts, considerably narrowing down the police's field of view. Despite having such a telling clue on their hands, investigators failed to learn anything more about their victim. In late 1976, the Woodland Jane Doe was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Years would pass before the case would pick up speed again. In 2015, when investigators received information that pointed to the Woodland Jane Doe being of Puerto Rican or Colombian descent, the tipster claimed that they believed that Woodland Jane Doe had moved from either of these countries to Boston, Massachusetts, more specifically the area of Jamaica Plain. This clue tied into a crude tattoo found on the young woman, but that lead eventually fizzled out. In 2021, the Baltimore County Police Department announced that they were working with Othram Labs to uncover the mystery of Woodland Jane Doe once and for all. Using genetic genealogy and other forensic methods, Othram discovered that the body found in 1976 belonged to 16-year-old Margaret Federalf of Alexandria, Virginia. Her family last saw Margaret in Alexandria in mid-1975 before she vanished into thin air. A missing person report had been filed, but investigators in different counties and states had failed to connect the dots. Margaret's body was found just 53 miles away from where she disappeared, a year after she had been reported missing. There are some speculations that Margaret may have been taken from Alexandria and put into some sort of human trafficking operation, which may be the source of the tattoo. She had been alive for a year from the time she had disappeared until her murder. Her brother is asking anyone who knew Margaret to come forward with any information they may have. They are looking for anyone who knew Margaret in 1975 or anyone who met her while she had been missing. The question of who killed Margaret is still being explored. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Baltimore County Police Department. This is kind of a connected update to a case we previously covered nearly 2 years ago. On October 18, 1983, a middle-aged couple was out gathering mushrooms in Lake Village, Indiana, when they came across an abandoned farm. There they discovered several shallow graves that contained the bodies of 4 deceased young men who had been drugged and stabbed. 2 of the men were quickly able to be identified as Michael Bauer and John Bartlett, but the identities of the 2 other men remained a mystery. They soon became known as Brad Doe and Adam Doe of the Newton County John Does. While it would take years for the John Does to be identified, it didn't take as long to identify their murderer, serial killer Larry Eyler. Also known as the Highway Killer, Eyler was already in police custody as a suspect for a series of murders when the formed bodies on the farm had been discovered. Eyler died in prison in 1994 from an AIDS-related complication while on death row for the murders of 15-year-old Danny Bridges. Posthumous confession, it was revealed that Eyler had murdered at least 21 young men that he'd picked up hitchhiking. Years passed without any successful leads on either John Doe's identity. Then in 2021, after 37 years, the Newton County Coroner's Office was finally able to identify Brad Doe by his true name, John Ingram Brandenburg Jr. John had gone missing from Chicago, Illinois in 1983 and was 19 years old at the time of his death. The last time his family saw him, he was leaving their home to visit a friend. Now it was Adam Doe's turn to be identified. He was described as a young black male between 15 and 18 years old. He had died between 1982 and 1983. Using the same methods to identify John, experts turned to genetic genealogy, and the DNA Doe Project stepped in to help. In July 2023, Adam Doe was officially identified as 16-year-old Keith Lavelle Bibbs, who had been from Chicago originally. For Eiler's death, he had been able to recall several details about Keith's abduction, but not his identity. He said that he had picked up Keith, who had been hitchhiking outside Terre Haute, Indiana. The family has not revealed much information about Keith as they are extremely private, but they did allow Keith's remains to be returned to Chicago, where they held a funeral for him with the family and the investigations who'd worked his case over 4 decades. On October 26, 1978, the Pershing County Sheriff's Office in Nevada received a call to come out to the Scosa Road, close to the town of Mlay, Nevada. When law enforcement arrived, they were greeted by a grisly scene. The remains of a badly decomposed adult female had been discovered stuffed into a garment bag. After dumping her so callously, her killer had dug a shallow grave and left her there to be discovered. Her body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where they hoped that her bones would garner more information. The medical examiner determined that the remains belonged to a middle-aged woman with red or auburn hair and was 5'5". Due to the state of her remains, a cause of death could not be determined, and it was marked as a homicide due to the circumstances in which she was found. Investigators had one last hope: her clothing. She was found wearing a dark green 3/4 length jacket with a white metallic safety pin attached, dark green pants with a long pink heavy sweater with a short-sleeved pullover-type t-shirt, and cotton underwear. Unfortunately, the case quickly went cold, and a crude reconstruction of her face had been made and circulated around the state. However, no one recognized her, and as the years passed, technologies advanced. Investigators created a digital reconstruction of her face and submitted her dental records. Her records didn't match any known missing person, and investigators felt as though they were stuck in a limbo. Several decades would pass without a word in the Mlay Jane Doe case. That was until March 2022, when the Pershing County Sheriff's Office reached out to Othram Labs. The Mlay Jane Doe's remains were sent off to Othram for genetic genealogy testing, and within months, they were able to find a match. In March 2023, Othram and the Pershing County Sheriff's Office held a joint press conference in which they identified the Mlay Jane Doe as Florence Charleston of Portland, Oregon. According to reports, Florence had spent most of her life in Cleveland, Ohio, and had moved to Portland shortly before she had died. Florence was in her late 60s, possibly around 68 when she died, and both investigators and her family remain baffled as to how she ended up in Nevada. As of November 2023, no suspects have been made public, and Florence's case remains stone cold. It was a late afternoon on Halloween Day in 1969 when 2 young boys saw something unusual while playing in a field in St. Petersburg, Florida. The boys watched as 2 older men in a truck dumped a black steamer trunk in a wooded area of 34th Street South, close to what used to be the Oyster Bar and the conjoined parking lot. After the men got back into their vehicle and drove away, the boys flagged down 2 officers who were on their routine patrols. Intrigued, officers approached the trunk with caution, unaware of what they were about to discover. As the 2 opened the trunk, they were greeted with horrific sight. Inside the trunk lay a woman wrapped in a large plastic bag, naked aside from a bloodied pajama top. It was clear that the woman had suffered several blunt force traumas to the head, and a men's Western-style bolo tie was still wrapped tightly around her neck. Shocked at what they had discovered, the officers ran to their car and immediately called for backup. Within the hour, the once quiet and serene St. Petersburg countryside was swarming with police officers. The woman's body was transferred to the District 6 medical examiner's office, which determined she was white, 25 to 35 years old, 5'9", 130 pounds with brown or black hair and brown eyes. The medical examiner also determined that she'd given birth at least once in her life and suffered from gallbladder issues. The woman's teeth were also said to be distinctive, with a small partial upper plate and several teeth missing. A copy of the woman's dental impressions was circulated to dentists around the area, but no one recognized them. Likewise, no one in St. Petersburg recognized the woman when an approximation sketch was distributed to local news outlets. Once the initial buzz of the case died down, the mystery of the trunk lady eventually went cold. investigators traced the trunk that she had been found in to the non-breakable trunk company. This vital piece of evidence yielded little clues, and the trunk lady was buried in an unmarked grave in St. Petersburg Memorial Park Cemetery. Every so often, investigators would pull her case file, hoping to uncover some new evidence, but the case, inevitably, sat cold. In 2010, with the passage of time and advancements in forensic science, the trunk lady was exhumed for further testing. Isotope testing revealed that the woman had likely hailed from the southeastern U.S. and was not a Florida native. Moreover, she had spent several years in northern U.S. before she'd been murdered. Samples of her hair and teeth were sent for DNA testing, however, they were deemed too degraded. In an incredible stroke of luck, Detective Wally Pavelski in the St. Petersburg Cold Case Unit found hair and skin samples that had been taken from the trunk lady's first autopsy in 1969. These samples had been perfectly preserved and were sent to Othram in Texas for genetic genealogy testing. Using these tests and records, Othram managed to trace the woman's family tree, and fortunately for them, a now adult close relative was also searching for the same woman. In May 2023, Othram and the St. Petersburg Police Department held a press conference in which they announced the trunk lady had been identified as 41-year-old Sylvia June Atherton of Tucson, Arizona. It had been Sylvia's daughter, Silen Gates, who had been searching for her mother and had been the one to put forward her DNA in hopes of finding some answers. Silen had said that she had been 9 the last time she saw her mother. She stated that her father had custody over her and her 11-year-old brother, and that she'd gone over to see her one day in Tucson, Arizona, and discovered that her mother had moved, packing the home seemingly overnight and leaving suddenly. She had been told that her mother had moved with her new husband, Stuart Brown, along with her 5-year-old sister, Kimberly and Brown, and older sister, Donna Lyndhurst, and her brother-in-law and Donna's husband, David Lyndhurst. Donna was 20 years old, and it was believed that she and David were relocating to Chicago. The couple also had a small child as well. It was unclear why the family had up and moved so suddenly, and after they left, no one heard from Sylvia again. Celine recognized the trunk when shown evidence from her mother's case, and said that her mother had used this as a TV stand and had been one of the items of furniture that had been taken when the family moved. According to reports, the cohort left Tucson for Chicago, Illinois, and Sylvia's movements thereafter remain unknown. It's also unclear if any of them had ever made it to Chicago, because Silen had to believe that Donna and David had ended up in Florida. Stuart Brown passed away in 1999 in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he'd been living for decades, and according to records, he had never filed any documents saying that he'd ever been married or had children. Brown had never reported his wife or daughter missing. As of October 2023, Sylvia's case remains unsolved. However, Celine is still hopeful of reuniting with her sister, Kimberly, who would be around 60 years old today, or Donna, who, if she was still alive, would be in her 80s. On March 21, 2016, just after 9 p.m., Judith Nicks in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, saying that she found her ex-husband dead in his room and that it looked like he had killed himself. Law enforcement would arrive at what they believed to be a suicide call. Judith would direct them to the primary bedroom, but it would quickly become evident that the suicide had been staged. The victim was 69-year-old Kenneth Nicks, who was born in 1946 in Louisiana, the eldest of 6 children. In 1966, he had married for the first time, and he and his wife had 3 children and moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Ultimately, the couple would separate, and shortly after their separation, his first wife committed suicide while on the phone with Ken. Keith remarried 3 more times after, hoping to find a good mother figure for his 3 young kids. He met Judith in 1984. Judith was also divorced and was working as an accountant with 2 teenage daughters. She had been married before in the 60s, but it had ended quickly after she'd had her daughters. She was originally from Texas before moving to Tulsa. The 2 got married in Las Vegas in 1985. They shared a house together in Broken Arrow. Kenneth had a successful business called Inland Divers Incorporated that he'd started in 1980. The couple is reported to have been happy for nearly 3 decades. They both worked for Inland Divers, where Ken did the tours and Judith ran the books. They had both shared a love for the sport and a passion for the business. However, their marriage would not last. Keith Nicks told Oxygen Media, quote, "My father raised me and my brother to be on our own and not to be dependent on anyone, but Judith coddled her kids and financed her kids all the time. They had a problem, and that caused turmoil between my father and Judy. Communication between the two was diminishing. In January 2011, Kenneth filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. He reportedly rescinded the case 16 days later. Then in August 2011, Judith filed for divorce, also citing irreconcilable differences. She also filed for a protective order against Ken. In seeking a protective order, she stated that she was in fear for her life and that her husband had a violent past, and that she'd been experiencing abuse for 2 years. The protective order case was dismissed when both Judith and Kenneth failed to appear in court. They eventually did get divorced in September of 2011. However, during their divorce proceedings, law enforcement had responded to at least 3 domestic phone calls to the home before things had settled. But not all of those calls were made by Judith. Law enforcement would discover that Kenneth had also made calls reporting violent instances with his soon-to-be 4th ex-wife. However, after their divorce was settled, the couple still spent a considerable amount of time together, so it hadn't seemed that strange that Judith still had a key to Ken's house. The medical examiner attended the scene, and initially, everything looked just as Judith had described. Judith had stated that she brought over supper for Ken and found him deceased in his bedroom. She said that he had a few medical conditions that caused him to experience chronic pain, and she said that Ken had told her that he had wanted to end his life because of the pain. Originally, she had told first responders that she had last seen Ken the day before when she brought him dinner the previous night, and she stated that his mental state was poor. She then said that she tried to call Ken that morning, but he didn't answer the phone. The first sign that the suicide had been staged was when police were moving the body and discovered that Ken had been shot twice in the head, which would have been a difficult feat. He also had bloodstains on his clothing. The bullet wounds were on his left temple, and he had blood on the right side of his sweater. The blood found on the clothing didn't match the position that he was found in, meaning that his body had been moved. The evidence wasn't matching Judith's story. The medical examiner would conclude that Kenneth had died closer to 7 a.m. that morning, 14 hours before Judith had made the phone call. Law enforcement then interviewed family members, which included Judith's daughters, Shelley and Angela. Shelley was interviewed first, and she had this big story about how she and Angela had never gotten along with Ken and that he was abusive. When asked to give her whereabouts for the day, she revealed that she'd been at Ken's house that morning, around 11 a.m., and she spoke to her mother in the driveway, and this contradicted Judith's alibi. Just a day after the shooting on March 22nd, Judith Nicks was arrested and charged with the murder of Ken Nicks. Not only her, but both of her daughters, Shelley Davis Pearson and Angela Moore, were arrested on accessories after the fact. Then the Broken Arrow Police Department had received a phone call from law enforcement in Tulsa saying a man, later identified as Angela's ex-husband, Tony Moore, had called. He said that he wanted to come forward and inform law enforcement that his ex-wife and sister-in-law had come over to his house around noon on March 21st and told him that Judith had shot Ken that morning. He said that the 3 women showed up to his house and were in his kitchen, trying to plan out what to do next, how to get away with killing Ken. He said that the 3 women were very close, they always had been, and so their behavior didn't exactly surprise him. But he didn't want to be involved in their scheme, and he told Judith that she needed to turn herself in. After Angela and Shelley were arrested, Judith's story changed. When she first called 911, she said it was a suicide, but after being faced with new, damning evidence, she changed her story. She then informed police that she'd gone to the house that morning, and Ken had threatened her, and said that she owed him money that he had spent on her daughters. She had reached for the gun he was holding, and in the struggle it went off twice. However, this would be nearly impossible based on his wounds. She then told law enforcement that she called her daughters, saying that an accident had happened and that she was going to clean it up and maybe stage it as a suicide. Judith's daughters would eventually be released and were offered immunity deals if they agreed to testify against their mother. In August 2016, Judith's bond was set at $250,000 with the stipulations that Judith Nicks had to turn in her passport, wear a GPS monitor, have a curfew, stay in Tulsa, have have no guns, and stay away from Ken Nicks's family. And with that, she was released on bond. Originally, her defense attorney had said that he was not sure she'd be able to get bond as all of her assets were being foreclosed on, in litigation, or being repossessed. Still, in September 2016, Judith managed to find the bond money and was released while awaiting trial. At the trial, the prosecution would theorize that Judith, who they discovered had been in extensive debt, had been approached by Ken. He was requesting money that he'd loaned Judith back, and she hadn't viewed that money as being a loan. In their divorce agreement, if Judith happened to survive Ken, she would get his house. The prosecution believed that this was the motive for staging the suicide in the hopes of gaining the home and getting out of debt. The defense would argue that Ken had been abusing Judith for years and that she was suffering from battered woman syndrome, and she'd only been trying to defend herself and shot Ken in self-defense. After a 5-day trial, the 80-year-old Judith Nicks was found guilty of first-degree murder in March 2017, and a month later was sentenced to life in prison. Her sentencing hearing was the first time Judith spoke in court, telling Kenneth Nicks's family that she was sorry. She'll be eligible for parole when she's 108 years old. On February 19, 1996, Dr. Daryl Sartorius, a heart surgeon in Cincinnati, Ohio, didn't show up for work and had not been answering his pages. His coworkers called law enforcement, requesting that they do a welfare check. Police arrived at the home of Dr. and Mrs. Sartorius. His wife, Dante, answered the door, and she said that she didn't know where he was. Police noted his car was still in the garage, and they asked if they could take a look. They discovered Daryl in the basement on a couch with a gunshot wound to his head. The investigation started with them looking at the cause of death as suicide, but some of the evidence would make the death look more and more suspicious. The first piece of evidence was that they found a second bullet hole in the couch. Someone going to shoot themselves doesn't usually take a test shot that his wife didn't hear upstairs. Blood spatter evidence was also not what they expected from a suicide. In his hand was the gun, but there was a significant amount of blood underneath the gun on his palm, which the handle of the weapon should have blocked. There was also a swipe of blood spatter on the front of the couch and his legs, which couldn't have been made via the gunshot wound. They hypothesized that it appeared to have come from another person standing in front of Daryl. Because of the peculiar circumstances of the evidence, Dante was brought into the police department for questioning. There they tested her hands for gunshot residue, and she tested positive. The medical examiner concluded on February 27th, after looking at all the evidence and the results of the gun residue tests from Dante and Daryl, that the victim had been murdered and that Daryl had not shot himself. The residue on the victim's head would indicate someone had shot him from behind. Also, police discovered that Dante had been the one to purchase the gun the day before Daryl was killed. And so, Dante was arrested. Her own mother is even reported to have called the police to tell them that it couldn't have been a suicide and that her daughter had definitely killed Daryl. Police would discover that Dante had a checkered past, and her name was actually Della. Della was from Cincinnati, and her father had died when she was only 3. Her mother quickly remarried, and at 18, Della was a high school dropout who found herself pregnant and married to her first husband, Joe Hoffer. The two would soon divorce, and news outlets reported that she had struggled to support the child and herself, and that the child ended up in foster care. Another reported that the child stayed with Joe Hoffer. It's not confirmed what happened to this child. However, Della, she married again and soon divorced in her early 20s. That was when she started going by the name Dante. She married a third time to a graphic artist named Grant Bassett. He would report that she would often threaten to kill him in their short 9-month-long marriage. Police would discover shortly after her divorce from Bassett that Della was convicted of threatening her next boyfriend with a gun. The boyfriend, stockbroker Lawrence Walker, would tell police that she told him that she was pregnant and threatened his life if she miscarried. Her fourth husband, computer consultant David Britton, reportedly told the news that he'd only survived the marriage because he hid the bullets for his gun. Then she met Dr. Daryl Sartorius when he was 55, a prominent heart surgeon in Cincinnati. Before marrying Dante, he had previously been married for 30 years and had 4 children with his first wife. And in 1994, the marriage ended. After his divorce, He was looking for a second chance at love when he went to a dating agency in the hopes of finding someone. This agency would be similar to an online dating site, where potential people could look at your profile in a book instead of online. Through the agency, he met a woman named Dante Britton and the two hit it off. After only dating for 4 months, the two got married in March 1995, and he didn't know her real name was Della Hall or that she had children or had 4 ex-husbands. Daryl had no idea who he had just married. At first, they had seemed like a happy couple to everyone, but that didn't last. Daryl bought them a home in a nice neighborhood and Della started racking up credit card bills. Even with Daryl making good money, it wasn't quite enough to fund the extravagant lifestyle that his new bride seemed to want to live. The two started fighting about money constantly. A work colleague would tell Daryl that he'd been talking about divorce. Investigators believe that this may have been Della's motive in killing her husband. She wouldn't get anything if they divorced, but she'd get almost $1 million if he died. What investigators believed happened was that Della had discovered Daryl had met with a divorce attorney. That was when she started putting things into motion. She bought a gun. She went down to the basement where Daryl was, came up behind him and shot him in the head, then took his hand and had him fire the gun into the couch. Then she just waited until the police arrived, pretending that she didn't know what happened, and tried to pass off his murder as a suicide. The media at the time would paint her as a black widow, someone who kills her partners. Newspapers would write, quote, Della Faye Hall Hofferbayer Bassett Britton Sartorius was the marrying kind, 5 times wed, each time selecting a man younger and wealthier than the last. 4 of the marriages ended in divorce, and some of her ex-husband claiming that they escaped with their lives. The 5th ended in a gunshot. During the 12-day trial, the prosecution would bring witness after witness, explaining Della's violent past. They'd show evidence that the head wound could not have been self-afflicted. The defense would hold firm that Daryl was a very depressed middle-aged man who killed himself. Her ex-husbands and boyfriend would also attend the trial, meeting for the first time. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours before they convicted Della of murder. She was sentenced to a maximum of 23 years to life in prison. Della died in prison on November 20, 2010, at the age of 60. The Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections informed the press that she had died of natural causes. She would have been eligible for parole in 2013. On June 16, 2022, at approximately 5 a.m., Susquehanna Township Police in Pennsylvania were called. The dispatcher said that the caller identified themselves as Evelyn Ciccarelli Henderson. Evelyn would tell the dispatcher that she found her husband dead on the back porch and that he killed himself by starting a fire and burning himself. Police would arrive at the home, and this was when things started to get peculiar. The dispatcher would note that something was very off about the caller. She was hesitant to answer questions. It was also noted that Evelyn had said she had heard her husband calling her name for help around 1 a.m., but didn't call 911 until hours later. When police arrived, they found the badly burned naked body of 84-year-old Carmen Henderson on the back porch. Carmen Henderson was known in the community as he retired in '95 as a Dauphin County deputy sheriff. The couple had previously owned a local limousine service. Evelyn Ciccarelli Henderson, now 66, had also been a local political candidate, having started as a county clerk at 27 in 1983. She ran again in 2011 for the Democratic nomination for a clerk of courts in Dauphin County. She even wanted to change her name from her married name Henderson to Ciccarelli Henderson. She told PennLive, quote, Ciccarelli is a powerful political name in Western Pennsylvania. Evelyn and Carmen had been married for 30 years. They had met while Evelyn had been a car salesman and Carmen was still a deputy. The medical examiner at the scene would inspect Carmen's body and discover fly larvae in his mouth and nostrils, indicating that he'd been deceased for some time, up to 3 days. Police asked Evelyn about the timeline, and this was when her story would keep changing. At first, she told them that her husband had committed suicide, and then she said it was an accident, that Carmen had been on the back porch smoking a cigar and had accidentally set himself on fire. After police informed her that she had told the dispatcher that she'd heard him at 1 when he called out her name and she saw his pant leg on fire. She then picked up the phone to call 911 at approximately 1 a.m. and had just put the phone down without actually calling. She then remembered and called at 5 a.m. She never admitted to why she delayed in calling the police. Evidence would show that he had not been alive when set on fire. After Carmen had retired, him and Evelyn had started Henderson limousine service. Evelyn herself would admit that she spent all of the business profits on vacation homes, spa days, and other various self-indulgent activities. After this misuse of money, the business foreclosed. During the police interview, Evelyn would also admit that the couple had been in extensive debt. She'd taken out a second mortgage on the house, and they had failed to pay it for some time. She said that she was going to be homeless as the house was going to be repossessed. Carmen had planned on going to live with his children from a previous marriage, but Evelyn was not welcome to join him. She would also admit that Carmen had a $10,000 life insurance policy, of which she was the sole beneficiary. After the inconsistencies found at the scene, and the fact that Evelyn would have financially benefited from his death, she was arrested and charged that day on June 16, 2022 with criminal homicide, aggravated arson, and arson. Fire inspection team would also conclude it was unlikely that the fire had been started by a cigar. Authorities never reported a cause of death for Carmen, and no new reports have been covered of the story since Evelyn was arrested. No details on whether or not she went to court or what pleas are available now. It was on July 17, 1982, when a horrific discovery was made in a meadow near Lake Tahoe. A woman had been found shot to death near a popular hiking trail. The woman dressed in shorts and t-shirt and was wearing a bathing suit underneath for what was likely supposed to be a day at the beach. She had no identification on her, and officers published multiple notices in local papers hoping to identify her. They estimated her age to be somewhere between 25 and 35. She was 5'5", petite frame, brown or hazel eyes, with brown hair worn in a bun. They also noted that she had given birth and had a vaccination scar on her left arm. There were no missing person reports that matched her description, and she was given the name sheet flat Jane Doe for the location she was found in. There wasn't a lot of evidence for investigators to go on. They had what they believed was a set of footprints from the killer, as well as DNA left at the crime scene. Doubly challenged with the task of finding not only the killer, but also identifying the victim, the case went cold. The case was reopened and re-examined for new leads by the Washoe County Sheriff's Office every few years, doing several different variations of facial reconstructions and publishing it to try and find someone who knew a woman that had gone missing in the summer of '82. In 2018, investigators reached out to Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, co-founder of the DNA Doe Project and founder of Identifiers International, to help in the case. They took on the case and for the first time used genetic genealogy to identify the victim and the perpetrator in a cold case. More than a dozen volunteers first worked to identify the victim. The volunteers ranged from students to grandmothers, some with former experience in law enforcement, but most just had a passion for genealogy. They first uploaded the victim's DNA to GeneMatch and broke up into small groups. Each group would tackle distant relatives and piece together family trees until they found relatives that shared more DNA, indicating that they were closer relatives. Eventually, they identified a distant cousin, and after 36 years, they were finally able to identify Jane Doe. Her name was Mary Ann Silvani. She had been born in Pontiac, Michigan in 1948. Her father had died while she was in high school, and her mother had left the family years before that. She had 2 brothers, and when she finished high school, all 3 siblings moved to California. Mary had never been reported missing, and she was 33 at the time of her death. Investigators also determined that she didn't have any children connected to her, records-wise, leaving them to believe that she may have given up a child for adoption at some point during her life. Once Mary was identified, Dr. Fitzpatrick's team turned their attention to her killer. Using the same process and 2,000 hours of work led to another potential match, James Richard Curry. They learned that Curry had killed himself in 1987 while in police custody for murdering 3 people in San Jose, California. 5 months after Mary had been murdered, Curry had been arrested for the murder of 2 people he knew, a husband and wife that were neighbors. He confessed to officers and directed them to a storage unit he rented. They went there and discovered the body of a 3rd victim that had been a missing person for a year, and further evidence in the storage unit indicated he was connected to a co-worker that had gone missing from Joaquin, California, Her remains were never found. Curry died days after his arrest. He committed suicide while awaiting a sentencing hearing. He was 37 years old. All of Curry's previous victims that are known were people he knew. His family stated that Curry was familiar with Lake Tahoe and went there often, but they weren't sure if his paths had ever crossed with Mary. Investigators do believe that more cases may be connected to Curry in the future. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.